The mountains had always felt alive, but on that cold October evening, they breathed like something struggling beneath the earth. The fog clung low, wrapping itself around the boots of Daniel Mercer as he pushed deeper into the forgotten ridges. He had come chasing a story, one whispered in gas stations, murmured around campfires, and quickly dismissed once the sun set. Folks called it a mountain myth, a tale born from cold dust and old fears. But the way their voices tightened, the way their eyes darted toward the timberline, as if expecting something to emerge, told Daniel there was more truth than fiction in their trembling warnings. Daniel had heard the warnings long before he ever set foot on the Appalachian Trail. But the human mind has a way of treating old stories like harmless echoes from another time. Locals in the nearest town had leaned in close when he asked about the missing settlement, their voices dropping to whispers as if the mountains themselves might overhear. They spoke of a coal trail that once linked the ridge to a mining camp, a trail that abruptly vanished after the entire settlement was reported gone in the 1940s. Some blamed a mine collapse, others claimed disease, and a few, those with eyes full of unease, swore it was something far darker, something that made families pack up in the middle of the night and leave their entire lives behind. When Daniel finally followed the faint direction an old man reluctantly offered, he expected nothing more than rusted machinery and forgotten shacks devoured by vines. Instead, he found the atmosphere changing the moment he crossed the timberline. The forest grew denser, quieter, as if it were listening. Even the birdsong thinned out until only the crunch of his boots filled the space. Hours into the hike, he stumbled on the abandoned coal trail the old man had described. It stretched through the forest like a scar, a narrow sunken path lined with broken stakes that once held lanterns. The trail dipped into the earth in a way that felt unnatural, as if decades of footsteps had carved it into the land. The air grew colder along it, sinking heavily across Daniel's shoulders, urging him forward with a strange pull he couldn't explain. He tried to shake off the unease by telling himself it was just the thrill of discovery, but the quietness around him felt too intentional, too heavy with anticipation. As he walked, he noticed how the trees leaned inward, their branches arching like ribs of some great beast swallowing the path. The deeper he went, the more the trail felt untouched, preserved not by nature, but by something that refused to let it rot or vanish. Daniel paused often to study the ground, noticing footprints fossilized in old mud, shaped oddly narrow, almost identical in size as if the same person, or set of people, had walked the trail repeatedly over generations. He wondered how such markings survived 70 years of storms and harsh winters. The question followed him like a shadow as he ventured deeper, and he began to feel as though the land beneath him carried memory, holding on to the impressions of those who once lived there. The abandoned coal trail, despite its age, felt less like a remnant of the past and more like a path still being used, a path that waited patiently for someone foolish enough to follow it into the heart of the mountains. Daniel had been walking for nearly an hour along the strange coal trail when he first noticed the forest changing shape around him. The trees grew tighter, their bark darker, their trunks twisted as though they had survived fires no one documented. The ground felt oddly warm in some patches and deathly cold in others, like the land couldn't decide whether it was breathing or dying. That was when his eyes caught the sudden break in the pattern. A hickory tree split down the middle by lightning or by something far more deliberate. At first he assumed the jagged shape at its center was just a natural scar, until he stepped closer and realized someone had carved deeply into the wood over many years. The figure wasn't random. It was disturbingly intentional. 3 men stood etched in the trunk, their bodies rigid, their faces identical, each with hollow eyes that seemed to stare beyond him rather than at him. Their shoulders touched, creating a strange symmetry that made Daniel's skin crawl. But the worst part wasn't the 3 men. It was the woman carved between them. Her body was smaller, her form curved, her posture stiff with a tension that almost looked real. Where her eyes should have been, the bark was brutally gouged out. Deep, messy grooves that suggested anger more than artistry. Lines resembling tears ran from the empty eye sockets, carved so forcefully that sap had long ago dried into dark, hardened streaks. Moss grew along the woman's carved hair, giving her a ghostly crown, and the bottom half of her figure appeared smothered by a thick knot of roots curling over the idol like grasping fingers. Whoever created this had poured more emotion into the woman's suffering than into the three men, whose expressions remained eerily blank. Daniel reached out instinctively but stopped just inches away, feeling a strange warmth radiating from the carving as though the tree had its own pulse. The scent of damp wood mixed with something metallic drifted upward, making him step back. He scanned the surrounding trees and froze when he saw more markings, smaller versions of the same symbol hidden behind trunks, etched into fallen logs, even scratched faintly into stones. It wasn't a single artwork, it was a system, a pattern repeated with unsettling precision. Each one carried the same imagery: 3 men, 1 woman, eyes removed. The markings varied in age. Some carvings were smooth with time, others fresh enough that the bark edges were still pale. Daniel's mind raced, trying to rationalize what kind of isolated community would create such symbols and why they would plaster them through the forest like territorial claims. The deeper he looked, the more he felt the carvings weren't warnings to intruders like him. They were messages to whoever lived here, reminders of a story or ritual that bound this hidden place together, and he had just stepped into the heart of it. Daniel forced himself to look away from the carvings and continue along the narrow path, but his mind kept circling back to the hollow-eyed woman and the 3 identical men. The image clung to him like a residue, refusing to let go. As the trail curved deeper into the forest, he noticed a second path splitting off from the main one, half swallowed by roots and overgrowth. Something about it felt intentionally concealed, as though it was meant to stay hidden unless someone was observant enough or foolish enough to find it. Curiosity tugged at him, and despite the chill crawling up his spine, Daniel stepped onto the forgotten branch of the trail. It led him to a small clearing where the ground dipped unevenly, marked by remnants of old camp gear scattered under a layer of moss. A collapsed tent frame lay leaning against a stump, and beside it, half buried in the dirt, was a leather-bound journal whose edges had softened with time, but not enough to erase the handwriting inside. Daniel knelt down and picked it up carefully, brushing off soil and brittle leaves. The first few pages were filled with neat notes, sketches of local plants, and observations about Appalachian social structures. The name, Eliza Grant, appeared repeatedly across the entries, revealing the journal belonged to an anthropology student who had vanished decades earlier during her field research. As Daniel flipped through the pages, the tone shifted sharply. Early curiosity gave way to unease as Eliza wrote about discovering an isolated settlement that had broken off from the surrounding communities before World War II. She described them as secretive, distrustful, and fiercely protective of their bloodline. Her handwriting grew more frantic as the entries continued. She mentioned 3 brothers who ruled the settlement, identical in appearance despite being born years apart. Villagers whispered that they had taken one wife collectively, claiming it was the only way to maintain purity within the bloodline. Eliza questioned the ethics and sanity of such a tradition, noting how the woman was never seen in daylight and how the children of the settlement shared uncanny similarities as if drawn from the same mold. As Daniel continued reading, the entries took an even darker turn. Eliza wrote about hearing footsteps outside her tent at night, always in sets of 3, always perfectly timed. She described feeling watched, followed, recorded by unseen eyes that seemed to know the moment she breathed, slept, or moved. The final pages grew almost illegible with shaky handwriting and smudged ink. Her last coherent sentences chilled Daniel to the core. She wrote that the wife was no longer just a woman but a figure of devotion, a living relic sealed away to ensure the brothers' line never died. The final line before the journal abruptly ended read, "They know I've seen her. They walk at night. They know when you breathe." The page after that was ripped out completely, leaving Daniel holding a book that felt less like a relic of the past and more like a warning he had discovered too late. Daniel closed the journal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the missing student's final words settle heavily in his chest. The forest seemed even quieter now, as if it had been listening to every line he'd read, waiting for him to reach the part that mattered. A strange pressure built in the air, urging him to keep moving even though every instinct screamed to turn back. Still, Driven by a mix of dread and the stubborn curiosity that had brought him here, he followed the cold trail until the trees finally parted to reveal what Eliza had described but never fully reached: the old homestead of the hidden Appalachian settlement. Except it wasn't the ruin he expected. Far from it. From a distance, the cabins looked abandoned: weather-beaten wood, sagging roofs, windows clouded with grime. But then Daniel noticed the thin thread of smoke curling from one of the chimneys, rising lazily into the air like a ghost stretching after decades of sleep. The smoke was fresh, unmistakably warm, and carried the faint scent of burning pine. His heartbeat quickened. Someone was here. Someone had been tending a fire not long ago. As he took cautious steps forward, trying to stay low behind the brush, he noticed more subtle signs of life. A pile of freshly chopped wood stacked neatly beside a porch, a set of footprints in the mud leading to a cellar door, and the faint glimmer of lantern light flickering behind a torn curtain. The place was alive in the eeriest way possible, maintained but unwelcoming, inhabited but unwilling to show its inhabitants. Daniel inched closer, trying to steady his breathing. The silence that surrounded the cabins didn't feel natural. There were no voices, no footsteps, no signs of movement other than the whispering smoke. It felt staged, like a scene arranged precisely so that he would question whether anyone truly lived here. Then, as he circled around the largest cabin, he heard it: a low, distant wail drifting upward from somewhere underground. It was faint, almost too soft to be real, but unmistakably human in its sorrow. The sound pressed into his ribs, vibrating with a long, drawn-out suffering that made his skin prickle. He followed the sound to a half-buried cellar door, old but recently used. The edges were scraped as if opened frequently, and the padlock hanging from its latch was broken, not rusted through, but snapped cleanly in half. Daniel froze, listening again. The wailing faded, replaced by a slow, rhythmic thumping, like something hitting stone from deep below. The hair on the back of his neck rose as the realization settled in. Someone, or something, was down there, alive. And whoever tended the fires, chopped the wood, and moved silently through these cabins had chosen not to show themselves, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Daniel backed away from the cellar door, his breath shallow as he tried to process the sound that had seeped up through the cracks of the earth. Every instinct urged him to leave the cabins behind, but the uneasy silence around him pulled him deeper, convincing him that if he turned around now, something would follow. He skirted the edge of the clearing, keeping low behind the brush, scanning for any sign of movement. At first, he saw nothing but decaying wood and sagging roofs, yet the sense of being watched only intensified. The feeling wasn't vague or imagined. It was precise, targeted, as if unseen eyes were tracking the rhythm of his steps. When he finally caught a flicker of movement near the tree line, he froze. A small figure darted between the trunks, quick and silent, so pale it almost blended into the mist. For a moment, Daniel thought it might have been a child, but its proportions seemed distorted, the limbs a little too long, the posture unnaturally stiff. More movement followed, shadows slipping between trees, silhouettes bending behind rocks, pale faces disappearing the instant he tried to focus on them. None of them approached, yet none of them fled. They lingered in a silent orbit around him, surveying him with a patience that felt inherited rather than learned. Under the sinking light of the afternoon, Daniel began to see the details more clearly. Some figures were small, likely children, but their heads were shaped oddly narrow, their eyes set deep into their skulls. Others were older, women hunched with age yet strangely agile, their movements too smooth for their years. The worst were the elderly men who remained motionless at the edge of the clearing, leaning against trees, their blind, clouded eyes pointed directly at him as though they could see him more clearly than anyone with perfect vision. They didn't speak. They didn't call out. They simply watched, as if evaluating him, comparing his shape and scent to something familiar. Daniel understood then that these people were not remnants of a community that had died out. They were descendants of something that had gone on living long after the world believed it gone. Their features told a story his mind resisted forming. Generations of shared blood, repetitive pairings, a lineage preserved not by chance, but by brutal tradition. The identical faces carved into the trees, the narrow footprints along the trail, the uncanny similarity among the children. It all fit together now. This was the living continuation of the brothers' regime Eliza had written about. They had never allowed outsiders to change their bloodline, never allowed their traditions to fade, and now their watching eyes seemed to weigh Daniel's presence as if measuring him for a place within their hidden world. As Daniel slowly stepped back, trying not to provoke them, the figures mirrored his movement in perfect synchronization. None of them spoke, yet the message was clear in their silent tracking. He had crossed into a land where the past hadn't died. It had multiplied, shaping flesh and bone into a living warning hiding in the mountains. Daniel's mind raced as the silent figures watched him with those strangely uniform faces, but what unsettled him more than their presence was the nagging detail from Eliza's journal. The wife, the woman the entire settlement had once shared. Her existence had felt like a disturbing myth as he read about her, something symbolic rather than real. But now, standing in the clearing surrounded by generations of her offspring, Daniel sensed that the story wasn't as simple as a woman who lived and died decades ago. There was a pull in the air, a faint vibration beneath his feet, as if something deeper in the earth still held authority over these people. He kept his movements slow as he edged toward the center cabin, the one with the freshest smoke curling from its chimney. Something about it felt different from the others, more carefully maintained, as if it were not just a home but a shrine. When he stepped onto the warped wooden porch, he felt the boards hum faintly under his weight, like a heartbeat trapped beneath the floor. The door creaked open with a reluctant moan, releasing a wave of cold, stale air. Inside, the cabin was dim and cluttered with relics of lives lived in isolation. Old lanterns, hand-carved tools, rope braided from human hair. But the thing that seized Daniel's breath was the framed portrait on the far wall. The painting was crude yet hauntingly detailed. The same woman from the carvings, her eyes gouged out, her expression caught between anguish and devotion. Around her stood the three brothers, identical in their rigid stance, their hands resting on her shoulders like chains. The room seemed to tighten around him as he approached the portrait. Beneath it sat a table covered in offerings, jars of preserved herbs, braided cloth dolls, scraps of bone wrapped in twine. Each object felt ceremonial, arranged not for aesthetics, but for worship. Daniel's gaze drifted to a narrow door at the back of the cabin, half concealed by a tattered curtain. A cold draft seeped through its cracks, carrying with it the faintest whisper, soft, breathy, almost melodic. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone felt intimate, as though someone was murmuring secrets directly into his ear. He stepped closer, heart pounding, and the whisper grew clearer. It wasn't multiple voices or the echo of wind slipping through the walls. It was a single voice, feminine and weary, speaking in a rhythm that felt like prayer. When he touched the door, the whisper stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so sharp it rang in his ears. The latch gave way under his hand, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. At the base, flickering candlelight illuminated something that made Daniel stagger. The woman from the carvings, the wife the brothers had shared, had not died generations ago. She lay preserved on a stone platform, her body unnaturally intact, her skin stretched thin but unbroken, her hair braided meticulously as if tended daily. Her chest moved almost imperceptibly, as though trapped between life and death. Around her, dozens of candles burned low, their wax pooling onto the floor like melted flesh. Her lips were parted slightly, and in the oppressive stillness, Daniel heard it again, a whisper, faint and trembling, emerging from the motionless figure itself. The people outside weren't just descendants. They were caretakers, guarding the woman they believed guided their bloodline. And now, with Daniel standing before her, the whisper grew sharper, as if recognizing a newcomer, as if welcoming him or warning him that he would never leave. Daniel felt the room constrict around him as the whisper from the preserved woman thinned into a trembling breath that did not belong in something that should have been long dead. The air was thick with the smell of melting wax and damp stone. Each breath he took weighted by the knowledge that he had crossed a boundary the people above had spent generations protecting. He stepped back from the platform, but even the smallest movement seemed to disturb the silence, causing the candles to flicker and cast frantic shadows that stretched across her still body. Her lips parted just slightly, too slowly, and another fragile whisper floated upward, shaping a sound that resembled his name, or perhaps the memory of someone else she had once known. Daniel wasn't sure if the woman was alive, trapped in some suspended state, or if something far older was speaking through her, using her body like a vessel. But he knew the descendants outside had not been watching him out of fear. They were waiting to see whether he would approach her, whether he would accept the role they had already carved for him long before he ever walked these mountains. A sudden thud above made dust rain from the ceiling. Then another. Slow, synchronized steps, 3 at a time, pacing across the wooden floorboards directly over the chamber. Daniel's stomach tightened as he recognized the pattern described in Eliza's journal. Footsteps that always came in threes, always evenly spaced, never hurried. The cellar door groaned, and muffled voices drifted downward, not speaking words but humming a low, ritualistic sound that grew louder with each passing second. Daniel pressed himself against the cold stone wall, realizing they had known where he was from the moment he stepped inside the cabin. They had followed him, guided him subtly, silently, expecting him to find the woman just as Eliza had. The humming swelled, vibrating through the floor, through the platform, through the woman's brittle frame. Her eyes, though gouged long ago, seemed to tighten at the edges, as if reacting to the sound. Then the cellar door slammed open, shaking the staircase. Shadows appeared on the steps, 3 shapes descending in perfect unison. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears, but he found himself unable to move, trapped by a force he couldn't name. As the figures came into view, their faces blurred by candlelight, he saw the unmistakable resemblance. 3 men, identical from forehead to jawline, their aging features an echo of the carved figures he saw in the woods. They didn't blink, didn't flinch, their pale eyes reflecting the candles like polished glass. They looked from Daniel to the woman on the stone, and then back at him with an expression that was neither anger nor surprise. It was recognition, acceptance, expectation. The humming outside intensified into a chorus, as though the entire settlement had gathered above the chamber, urging the brothers onward. Daniel realized with crushing clarity that the descendants had not merely preserved their bloodline. They had been waiting for it to continue, and the moment he stepped into the mountains, they had decided he would be the next thread woven into their regime.